In this lecture, we're going to provide an introduction to regression analysis. And when a regression analysis is conducted, the attempt here is to predict a future event on a new sample of data. So the regression analysis is carried out on an existing set of data and with the objective here of trying to predict that future event if a new sample becomes available. And so this is based on the findings of that previous sample that researchers have in hand. And regression analysis becomes a useful tool for forecasting, whether it's forecasting the weather, forecasting disease numbers, forecasting financial outcomes or other health outcomes. Regression analysis is the statistical procedure that carries this out. And identifying the two major variables in a regression analysis, we start with what's called the criterion variable, and this is typically your outcome variable of a study. And the other major variable is called the predictor variable, and this is the variable that is involved in predicting the outcome or the criterion variable. Now, regression analysis is typically carried out following a correlation analysis, but when using a computer software program, these programs are designed to carry out both at the same time if the regression analysis is selected. So if one uses a software program, one can actually carry out a correlation analysis in isolation without a regression analysis. But if one wishes to carry out a regression analysis, then correlation automatically is conducted. And in terms of the role of correlation, typically as two sets of data that demonstrate a lower correlation value, that's our typical Pearson R value, that in terms of a regression analysis, that translates to a greater margin of error in a prediction or a greater variability around that predicted variable. In this unit, we're going to focus on single variable or single predictor regression, and that will lead us eventually into multiple regression, in which is involving more than one predictor variable. And the example that we'll use here in this initial video is whether personality can predict student GPA or grade point average. What you're seeing here on the right-hand side of the slide is a poster from a movie produced a number of years ago called Traffic. And this is an interesting movie because it focuses on the drug trade between the United States and Mexico. And what makes this movie unique here is that there's an opening scene where a drug trafficker is explaining to two undercover officers how he used multiple regression analysis to predict the best time to smuggle drugs into the United States using a very objective approach. So this is not to promote the use of regression analysis for nefarious or illegal purposes, but it's the only movie I can think of that ever mentioned regression analysis. But pivoting back to our question of whether personality can predict student GPA, based upon this question as stated, this would imply a single predictor regression approach would be used. Now, if we start with a very general question here, where do we start? The first place to start is to define those variables or the item of interest. And when we talk about personality and GPA, typically our GPA is going to be the important variable in this question. So we would set that as the criterion variable. Now, that's not to say that a researcher can swap these two variables if there's a research justification for it. But in this example, we're going to go forward with the GPA as the outcome variable we wish to predict. And so now we define the predictors. I put in parentheses the S because this could potentially involve multiple predictors. And so we're going to use personality Now, personality is an interesting trait that has been described historically via lots of descriptions. And so we know that people are often defined or described as having an outgoing personality. They're private, they're quiet, they have a charismatic type of personality. So, this is actually starting to complicate our ability to answer our primary question. Now, for research purposes, we must operationalize the definition of personality. And that, by stating this, what we're doing is we will be defining personality in context of the research question. It starts with a conceptual definition, but eventually we move on to something that is very tangible and useful in the statistical procedure. And so to understand personality, we'll take a look at a few historical figures that have contributed a great deal to our understanding of this trait people possess over a number of years. Gordon Allport was an American psychologist that really initiated much of the detailed work in trying to understand personality. And through his work, he compiled a tremendously large number of words to describe people's personality or their traits. Some of those words are indicated here in this fourth bullet item: outgoing, private, quiet, charismatic. But Dr. Alport was really the first psychologist here, researcher, that began this work. Interestingly, here, this is not related to the topic here, but this is a 1959 song. This is a link to YouTube by a song called Personality. I just thought you might find it enjoyable after you completed this lecture, or maybe take a break to listen to an old song on personality. But as we know with any sort of variable or any sort of research question, it undergoes a degree of development. And Raymond Cattell was a British psychologist who furthered the understanding of personality by identifying two key types of personality traits, and he used something called factor analysis. We won't be covering factor analysis in this unit, but it's a statistical method that simultaneously analyzes many variables. So in some studies, there is a tremendously large number of possible predictor variables for an outcome, but factor analysis is a way to examine correlated predictor variables and to reduce the number of variables that will eventually go into a regression analysis. An interesting discussion, again, not central to regression analysis, and this is a link to a 1980s, a 1990 debate between Dr. Barry Mailer and Dr. Rushton on what was called the Phil Donahue show as it relates to the predictability of race on intelligence scores. And there was some controversial research published by Dr. Rushton from the University of Western Ontario that really was quite flawed. And this was a very interesting debate on that show to highlight some of the flaws in that research. But pivoting back to the work of Raymond Cattell, the two basic types of traits were defined as surface traits. And when you think about something on the surface, these are the behaviors that are observable by other people, easily observable personality traits, and there are many. But he also termed what he called source traits. So on the surface, we see people's behavior, but what drove that behavior? And Raymond Cattell surmised that they were source traits that drove those surface traits. And the source traits, not as observable, but he hypothesized that these were foundational, that resulted in these behaviors. And he again hypothesized that the number of source traits were much, much smaller than the number of observable traits or these observable behaviors. So Raymond Cattell proposed that source traits were a product of heredity and the environment. And this gave rise to the debate, the ongoing debate of nature versus nurture. So in terms of a person's behavioral patterns, a person's personality, to what extent is that influenced by their genes or influenced by their upbringing and the environment in which that person grew up in. So Raymond Cattell identified and narrowed his view or narrowed his work to identify 171 surface traits. And this was the combined action of several source traits. As an example, Raymond Cattell identified a source trait as extroversion. And so extroversion is that personality trait that relates to the degree to which a person exhibits particular social interaction behaviors, and terms that were used such as talkativeness, energy, warm, gregarious, assertive. So extroversion is the source trait that gave rise to these more observable personalities or these more observable behaviors. Another psychologist, Hans Eisnick, simultaneously was examining personality, and he identified three unique, what he termed dimensions: an introversion, extroversion, which we'll just label as the symbol uppercase E, neuroticism for N, and psychotism as P. So in terms of introversion, extroversion, what Hans Eisnick examined here was a continuum of some of these source traits that would give rise to many of these observable behaviors. And so introversion, a person that may be categorized as highly introverted, is somebody that would be highly reactive to stimuli. A person that was very extroverted is somebody who demonstrates a high degree of that social interaction, being either warm, gregarious, or assertive, would tend to be less reactive to stimuli. In terms of neuroticism, once again, Hans Eisnick identified a continuum for this particular source trait. So highly neurotic was characterized by a person who exhibited behaviors as being that could be described as restless or excitable, through the continuum to the other extreme, where a person would rank or score on the low end of the scale is somebody that will be calm or stable. In terms of psychotism, on the high end is somebody that may exhibit behaviors or surface traits such as cold or impersonal, to a low degree of psychotism where somebody would be empathetic and caring. And so the work here really sets up a continuum as opposed to just having a dichotomous categorization of a person's personality. And much of that work to this day has really summarized into what is widely accepted in the field of psychology as the 5-factor model of personality, or just simply referred to as the Big Five. And as the work of Raymond Cattell used statistical factor analysis, the Big Five model has developed through that same statistical approach. And OCEAN is the acronym for these different personality source traits. So O for openness is a continuum that describes a person that is conforming or very practical in terms of having that open type of personality, to the other extreme where a person is not conforming to the rules and tends to be very imaginative. C is for conscientiousness, And once again, we see another continuum where on the one end, people may be described or have behaviors that appear to be lazy or spontaneous, to the other end where people are ambitious or punctual in terms of their conscientiousness. We see extroversion as a key source trait that would describe people's tendency to be a loner or to be very quiet, or to the other extreme, sociable or talkative. Agreeableness, for the A in the acronym, describes those surface traits that might uh, 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 describe somebody as being rude or uncooperative, to the other extreme, where a person may be described and give out behaviors that would suggest a person's good natured or trusting. And in terms of neuroticism, this scale ranges from a person who would appear to be calm and even tempered in a variety of situations to a person that would be quite temperamental or emotional in different situations. And so this model here can be quantified because there are validated questionnaires that separates these 5 personality traits and can apply a numerical value based upon the outcome of a number of questions regarding a person's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And because the field of psychology has validated an approach to apply a numerical value, the numerical value is helpful when we ask this question here. So, do highly conscientious individuals score greater GPAs? And this is an approach that can quite handily be examined via single predictor regression. So, as the first example we talked about, GPA would be our outcome variable, and because we only have one variable clearly indicated in the question, we have one predictor. Now, if I take the first question and restate it in a more general sense, so can personality predict GPA? Now by using a much more general term for our predictor variable, this, and knowing now that we have the big 5 model for personality traits, this approach would suggest that we would need to use a multiple regression approach where we would take measures of all 5, because all 5 can be quantified individually using those validated questionnaires, and we would feed all 5 numerical values into a multiple regression statistical model to examine if there is a predictive value in terms of the outcome, which is GPA. So this ends our first video here on regression analysis.